This 1923 portrait of two women looks charming, until you discover who they really were. The autumn rain hammered against the windows of Henderson's estate auctions in downtown Savannah, Georgia, creating a rhythmic backdrop to the Saturday afternoon sale. David Martinez moved through the crowded room with practiced efficiency, his trained eye scanning the tables laden with forgotten treasures from the Caldwell estate. As a historian specializing in African American history in the post-Civil War South, he had learned to recognize value where others saw only dust and obsolescence. Most bidders clustered around the furniture and jewelry, their voices rising in competitive fervor. David preferred the quieter corners, where photographs and documents lay stacked in cardboard boxes, overlooked and undervalued. He had built his career on these overlooked fragments of history, pieces that filled the gaps in the official narrative that had so often excluded black voices and experiences. In the far corner, beneath a water-stained portrait of Confederate officers, he found what he was looking for: a wooden crate filled with photographs, letters, and miscellaneous papers. The auction house had labeled it simply Lot 247, Vintage Photographs, Various. David knelt beside the crate, his fingers carefully sorting through the contents. Most were typical: family portraits, vacation snapshots, formal studio photographs of white families frozen in Victorian stiffness. Then he saw it. The photograph was larger than the others, mounted in an ornate silver frame that had tarnished to a mottled gray-green. The image showed two black women standing before a magnificent Victorian mansion. Unlike most photographs of black individuals from that era, which typically showed them in servants' quarters or performing menial labor, these women were positioned prominently in the center of the frame, directly in front of the main entrance. What struck David immediately was their clothing. Both women wore elaborate dresses that would have been expensive even by white standards of the time. High-necked blouses with intricate lace details, long skirts with carefully pressed pleats, and delicate brooches at their collars. Their hair was styled in the fashion of the era, swept up in elegant arrangements. They stood with perfect posture, their chins lifted slightly, their expressions serene and dignified. The woman on the left appeared to be in her early 30s, tall and slender with sharp cheekbones and eyes that seemed to look directly through the camera lens. The woman on the right was slightly shorter and rounder, perhaps a few years older, with a softer face, but an equally composed demeanor. Their hands were folded in front of them in identical poses, as if they had been carefully instructed by the photographer. David turned the frame over. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "Grace and Florence, Whitmore Estate, April 1904. He felt his pulse quicken. The Whitmore name was well known in Savannah's history, one of the city's most prominent families in the early 20th century, wealthy merchants who had maintained their fortune even after the economic devastation of the Civil War. But he had never come across any mention of Grace and Florence in the historical records he had studied. The photograph was remarkably well preserved, the details crisp and clear despite being nearly 120 years old. The mansion behind the women was imposing. 3 stories of pristine white wood, with ornate gingerbread trim along the eaves, tall windows with lace curtains visible inside, and a wide porch supported by classical columns. The grounds were immaculate, with manicured gardens visible at the edges of the frame. David checked his watch. The bidding for Lot 247 would begin in 10 minutes. He calculated quickly. His research budget for the month was limited, but something about this photograph demanded his attention. There was a story here, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be uncovered. When the auctioneer called the lot, David was the only bidder. He acquired the entire crate for $75. Back in his apartment in the historic district, David cleared his dining table and carefully unpacked his purchase. Rain continued to fall outside, the sound now soothing rather than oppressive. He set up his high-resolution scanner, a piece of equipment that had proven invaluable in his research, capable of capturing details invisible to the naked eye. He removed the photograph from its frame with painstaking care, noting that the paper was of exceptional quality, the kind used for important family portraits meant to last generations. The edges were slightly yellowed, but the image itself remained remarkably sharp. He placed it on the scanner bed and initiated a high-resolution scan at 2400 dpi. While the scanner worked, David made coffee and opened his laptop. A quick search of historical records confirmed what he already knew. The Whitmore family had been pillars of Savannah society. Thomas Whitmore had owned a successful importing business, and his wife Charlotte had been active in various social clubs and charitable organizations. They had lived in the mansion on Forsyth Park until 1904, when David stopped reading. His coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. According to the Savannah Morning News Archive, Thomas and Charlotte Whitmore had died on April 23, 1904, both of apparent arsenic poisoning. The deaths had been ruled suspicious, but no charges were ever filed. The mansion had been sold shortly after, and the Whitmore line had ended with them, as they had no children. April 1904, the same month written on the back of the photograph. The scanner beeped, indicating completion. David transferred the file to his computer and opened it in his photo editing software. He zoomed in slowly, examining every detail with forensic precision. The women's faces appeared first. Even at this magnification, their expressions remained composed, almost mask-like in their serenity. But as David studied their eyes more closely, he noticed something that made him lean closer to the screen. Their gazes weren't vacant or subservient, as was common in photographs of black servants from that era. Instead, there was an intensity there, a focused determination that seemed at odds with their peaceful poses. He zoomed in further on their hands, folded demurely in front of them. That's when he saw it. The woman on the left, Grace, according to the inscription, had deep scars on her hands. Not the kind of scars that came from ordinary domestic work, but thick, raised keloids that suggested severe injuries. Some ran across her knuckles, others disappeared beneath the lace cuffs of her sleeves. They had been partially obscured by the positioning of her hands and the limitations of photographic clarity in 1904. But with modern scanning technology, they were unmistakable. David's throat tightened. He moved his examination to the background of the photograph, studying the mansion itself. The windows on the ground floor were clearly visible, their lace curtains pulled back to show darkened interiors. He increased the magnification to maximum, adjusting the contrast and brightness. In one of the ground floor windows, partially obscured by shadow, he could make out the interior of what appeared to be a basement stairwell. And there, barely visible in the darkness, were metal bars. Not decorative ironwork, prison bars. The Georgia Historical Society occupied a beautiful building on Hodgson Hall, its reading room filled with researchers, bent over documents and microfilm machines. David arrived when the doors opened Monday morning, having spent the weekend unable to think about anything but the photograph and what it might reveal. He requested everything they had on the Whitmore family and the deaths of Thomas and Charlotte Whitmore in April 1904. The archivist, an older white woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had worked there for 30 years, returned with 3 boxes of materials and several rolls of microfilm. "The Whitmore case," she said, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper. "That's one of Savannah's enduring mysteries. Nobody ever figured out what really happened." She paused, studying David with curiosity. "What's your interest in it?" "I found a photograph," David replied carefully. 2 women who worked at the estate. I'm trying to learn more about them." Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted subtly. "The servants? I don't think we have much on them. The records from that era, rarely documented." She trailed off, the unspoken truth hanging between them. David nodded. He understood. The historical record had systematically excluded black lives, reducing people to mere footnotes in the stories of white families. But he had learned that absence in the official record often meant there were other stories, hidden stories, waiting to be found. He started with the newspapers. The Savannah Morning News had covered the Whitmore deaths extensively in late April and early May 1904. The articles painted a picture of shock and scandal. Thomas Whitmore, aged 52, and his wife Charlotte, aged 48, had died within hours of each other after attending a dinner party at their home. Both had exhibited symptoms consistent with arsenic poisoning, severe vomiting, abdominal pain, and eventual organ failure. The initial investigation had focused on the dinner guests, all prominent members of Savannah society, but they had shown no symptoms. Attention then turned to the household staff. According to the articles, the Whitmores employed 2 black women as domestic servants, Grace and Florence. No last names were provided. The articles described how police had searched for the women immediately after the deaths, but both had vanished. Their rooms in the servants' quarters had been found empty, their few possessions left behind. A manhunt was organized, with police searching the black neighborhoods of Savannah, but no trace of Grace or Florence was ever found. The newspaper coverage took on an increasingly inflammatory tone. Headlines screamed about dangerous criminals and ungrateful servants who had murdered their benevolent employers. One editorial called for increased vigilance in monitoring domestic workers, suggesting that the deaths proved black servants could not be trusted in white households. But David noticed what the articles didn't say. There was no mention of motive. No discussion of why 2 women who were supposedly well treated would commit such a crime. No interviews with neighbors or other members of the black community who might have known Grace and Florence. He switched to the police records, which provided more details but raised more questions. The investigation file noted that arsenic had been found in the Whitmore's food, specifically in the roasted chicken served at dinner. The servants had prepared the meal, and both Grace and Florence had been seen in the kitchen that afternoon. But the file also contained a curious detail, a doctor's statement indicating that Charlotte Whitmore had purchased arsenic from a pharmacy 2 weeks before her death, ostensibly for killing rats in the basement. David photographed every page of the police file with his phone. As he worked, he noticed a single sheet of paper that had been paperclipped to the back of the file, as if added later. It was a handwritten note from a Detective Morrison, dated June 1904. Interviewed neighbors on Whitaker Street. Multiple residents report hearing screams from Whitmore residents on several occasions in months prior to deaths. Mrs. Dawson claims she saw one of the Negro women with visible injuries. Recommend further investigation. The note was unsigned. There was no indication that any follow-up investigation had occurred. David spent the next week tracking down any possible leads. He searched through church records, death certificates, and census data, trying to find any mention of Grace and Florence beyond the few newspaper articles about the Whitmore deaths. It was slow, frustrating work, made more difficult by the systematic exclusion of black individuals from official records. Then he found something unexpected. In the archives of the First African Baptist Church, one of the oldest black churches in Savannah, he discovered a collection of oral histories recorded in the 1970s as part of a community heritage project. The interviews had been conducted with elderly members of the congregation, many of whom had been born in the early 1900s and remembered stories passed down from their parents and grandparents. One interview immediately caught his attention. It was with a woman named Esther Williams, who had been 92 years old at the time of the recording in 1976. The interviewer had asked her about life in Savannah in the early 20th century, and Esther had shared a story about her grandmother. David listened to the crackling tape recording in a small listening room at the church archives. Esther's voice was thin but clear, her accent thick with the cadences of the Old South. "Yeah, my grandmama. She used to tell me about these two women who worked for a white family on Forsyth Park. Grace and Florence, their names were. This was before I was born, you understand. Back when things were real bad for colored folks, even worse than when I was growing up. My grandmama said those women, they suffered terrible things in that house." The interviewer's voice interjected, "What kind of things?" There was a long pause on the tape. Then Esther continued, her voice dropping lower. "My grandmama said they wasn't really hired help. They was kept there, locked in at night, beaten if they tried to leave. The white folks, the Whitmores, they had money and connections, so nobody would help those women. Not the police, not nobody. This was just how things were, you understand." Another pause. David could hear Esther breathing, as if gathering strength to continue. "My grandmama said that one night those women decided they couldn't take no more. They did what they had to do to get free. After that, they disappeared. Some folks said they went north. Others said they died trying to escape. But my grandmama always said that the colored community helped them, hid them, gave them new names, helped them start over someplace safe. She said it was justice, even if the white folks' law didn't see it that way." The interviewer asked if Esther knew what had happened to Grace and Florence, but the old woman said her grandmother had never told her more. "It was safer not to know," Esther explained. "That way, if the law came asking questions, you couldn't tell them nothing even if you wanted to." David rewound the tape and listened again, transcribing every word. This was the first testimony he had found that suggested Grace and Florence had been held in forced servitude, that they had been victims rather than criminals. But it was oral history, secondhand information passed down through generations. He needed more concrete evidence. He returned to the photograph that had started this investigation. If Grace and Florence had been imprisoned in that house, locked in and abused, then the photograph took on an entirely different meaning. It wasn't a portrait of well-treated servants. It was something far more sinister. He thought about the timing. The photograph had been taken in April 1904, the same month the Whitmores died. What if it hadn't been a simple family portrait? What if it had been staged for a specific purpose? David had read about cases where slaveholders and employers who practiced forced labor would create photographic evidence of well-treated workers to show to authorities or business associates. The practice had been documented in several scholarly works about labor conditions in the post-Reconstruction South. If the Whitmores had been keeping Grace and Florence in servitude, they might have taken the photograph as insurance, as proof that their workers were happy and well cared for. But if that were true, then the composed expressions on Grace and Florence's faces took on a chilling significance. They had been forced to stand before the camera, dressed in fine clothes that weren't truly theirs, and pretend that everything was normal. They had been made to perform contentment while being held prisoner. David's next breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While researching conditions in Savannah in 1904, he contacted Dr. Michelle Foster, a colleague at the Savannah College of Art and Design who specialized in medical history. He explained his investigation and asked if there were any medical records from that era that might shed light on the case. Dr. Foster was intrigued. "The Whitmore case," she said over coffee at a cafe near the college. "I remember reading about that in medical journals. The poisoning itself was fairly straightforward. Arsenic was common in homes back then, used for pest control. But let me check something." She returned 2 days later with photocopies of documents from the archives of Candler Hospital, which had served Savannah since 1804. "I found something interesting," she said, spreading the papers across David's desk. Candler Hospital kept separate records for black patients. They had a segregated ward, of course, and I found admission records for 2 women matching the description of your Grace and Florence. David leaned forward, his heart racing. The records showed that a woman identified only as Grace, Negro, domestic servant, had been treated at Candler Hospital in January 1903, 15 months before the Whitmore deaths. The admission notes described multiple injuries, fractured ribs, lacerations on her back consistent with whipping, and severe bruising on her arms and legs. The attending physician had noted, patient reports injuries from fall, injuries inconsistent with stated cause, suspect abuse, but patient refuses to elaborate. A second record from August 1903 showed that another woman, Florence, Negro, domestic servant, had been treated for a broken wrist and burns on her hands and forearms. The notes indicated the patient claimed she had been injured while cooking, but the physician had written, pattern of burns suggests defensive wounds, patient extremely fearful and withdrawn. Both records listed the same address, the Whitmore residence on Forsyth Park. This is evidence of systematic abuse, Dr. Foster said quietly. These women were being brutalized, and the medical professionals who treated them suspected it but didn't intervene. That was unfortunately common at the time. Black patients had almost no legal recourse, especially against white employers. David studied the records, his anger building. Grace and Florence had sought medical help, had left a paper trail documenting their suffering, but no one had helped them. The system designed to protect citizens had failed them completely because of their race and their status as domestic workers. He returned to the photograph once more, examining Grace's scarred hands with new understanding. Those scars weren't just from hard work. They were evidence of torture, of repeated injury, of suffering that had been inflicted deliberately over an extended period. The photograph had been taken in April 1904. According to the timeline he was building, Grace and Florence had endured at least 15 months of documented abuse, and likely much longer. The medical records showed injuries in January and August of 1903, but there were no earlier records because Candler Hospital's archives before 1903 had been destroyed in a fire. 3 days after the photograph was taken, Thomas and Charlotte Whitmore were dead, and Grace and Florence had disappeared. David pulled up the police file again, looking at it with fresh eyes. The detective's note about screams heard from the Whitmore residence, the neighbor who had seen one of the women with visible injuries. These weren't just passing observations. They were evidence of ongoing violence that multiple people had witnessed, but no one had stopped. He thought about the arsenic that Charlotte Whitmore had purchased. The police had assumed it was for rats, but what if there had been another purpose? What if the Whitmores had used the threat of poison as another form of control, another way to keep Grace and Florence compliant? David's investigation led him to Dr. James Franklin, a retired professor of African American Studies at Savannah State University. Doctor. Franklin had spent his career researching the hidden networks that black communities had created in the South during and after slavery, the informal systems of mutual aid, protection, and resistance that operated beneath the notice of white authorities. They met at Dr. Franklin's home in a quiet neighborhood on the east side of the city. The elderly professor, now in his 80s, listened intently as David explained what he had discovered about Grace and Florence. What you're describing, Dr. Franklin said when David finished, sounds like what we call the Shadow Railroad. It wasn't as organized or as well known as the Underground Railroad before the Civil War, but it served a similar purpose in the decades after Reconstruction ended. He explained that while slavery had been legally abolished, forced labor continued in various forms throughout the South. Sharecropping systems trapped families in debt. Convict leasing programs essentially re-enslaved black men arrested on spurious charges. And in some cases, wealthy families simply kept black workers imprisoned in their homes, knowing that the legal system would not intervene. When people managed to escape these situations, Dr. Franklin continued, they needed help to truly disappear. The black community created networks to provide that help. Safe houses, false identities, passage to other cities. It was dangerous for everyone involved, but people did it because they understood that survival sometimes required breaking unjust laws. He walked to his bookshelf and pulled down a leather-bound journal. This belonged to my great-grandfather. He was a pastor at First African Baptist Church in the early 1900s. He kept coded records of people the church helped. David's hands trembled slightly as he opened the journal. The entries were cryptic, using initials and biblical references. But one entry from May 1904 caught his eye. 2 sisters in flight, G and F passage secured north. New names, Ruth and Naomi. May the Lord protect them on their journey. Ruth and Naomi, David whispered. The biblical story of 2 women who supported each other through loss and hardship. Dr. Franklin nodded. My great-grandfather used biblical names for people who needed new identities. It was his way of documenting their stories while protecting them. If those are your Grace and Florence, then they didn't die trying to escape. They made it out, and they were helped by people who understood what they had endured. David photographed the journal page, his mind racing. This suggested that Grace and Florence hadn't just vanished randomly. They had been extracted by an organized network, given new identities, and helped to start new lives somewhere far from Savannah. The community had protected them, had chosen to stand with 2 women who had killed their abusers rather than turn them over to a justice system that had never protected black people. Do you think there's any way to find out what happened to them after they left? David asked. Dr. Franklin considered the question. It would be difficult. The whole point of these new identities was to make people impossible to trace, but he paused, thinking. There were certain cities where people were commonly sent: Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, places with large black populations where newcomers could blend in, where there were churches and mutual aid societies ready to help. He suggested David look for women named Ruth or Naomi who appeared in church records or census data in those cities around 1904 or 1905. Women with no documented history before that time, women who were approximately the right age. It's a long shot, Dr. Franklin admitted. But if you're right about who these women were and what they did, their story deserves to be told. They weren't criminals. They were survivors who fought back against a system that treated them as property, even after slavery had supposedly ended. David spent the next month immersed in archives, both physical and digital. He started with church records from Philadelphia, which had been a major destination for black migrants from the South in the early 20th century. The city's black churches had kept meticulous records of new members, noting when they joined and often where they had come from. At the Mother Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, founded in 1794 and the oldest AME church in the nation, he found what he was looking for. In the membership records from September 1904, 2 women had joined: Ruth Washington and Naomi Johnson. Both were listed as being in their early 30s. Both had come from the South, with no specific location given, and both had joined on the same day. The coincidence was too perfect. David requested additional records from the church. He found that Ruth and Naomi had been active members of the congregation for many years. Ruth had worked as a seamstress, Naomi as a cook in a hotel. They had lived at the same boarding house on Lombard Street, in the heart of Philadelphia's black neighborhood. But that wasn't all he found. In the church's archive of personal papers donated by deceased members, there was a small collection belonging to Ruth Washington, who had died in 1947 at the age of 76. The collection included letters, photographs, and a handwritten journal. David's hands shook as he opened the journal. The first entry was dated October 1904. "We are safe here. The nightmares continue, but we are safe. We have been given a chance to live as we were meant to live, as free women, not prisoners. I do not know if I will ever truly leave that house behind, but I am grateful for every day that I wake up and am not there." Later entries documented Ruth's life in Philadelphia, her work as a seamstress, her friendships with other women in the boarding house, her involvement in the church. But scattered throughout were references to the house and what we did to escape. Well, one entry from January 1905 was particularly revealing. "Anne and I spoke today about whether we did right. She says we had no choice, that we would have died there if we had done nothing. I believe she is correct. They were going to kill us eventually. I saw it in her eyes, in the way she looked at us, as if we were insects to be crushed. We took the poison she had bought, the poison she may have intended to use on us, and we put it in their food. I do not feel guilt for their deaths. I feel only relief that we survived." David read the passage 3 times, his heart pounding. This was a confession, written decades after the fact, when Ruth felt safe enough to acknowledge what she and Florence, now Naomi, had done. Other entries painted a picture of the abuse they had suffered. Ruth described being beaten regularly, being locked in the basement for days without food, being forced to work 18-hour days with no pay. She wrote about how Charlotte Whitmore had taken particular pleasure in tormenting them, inventing infractions to justify punishment. She described how Thomas Whitmore had threatened to report them to the police on false charges if they tried to leave, knowing that the police would believe a white man over black women. "We were not the first," Ruth wrote in an entry from 1906. "We found letters in the basement, hidden behind loose bricks. Other women had been kept there before us. I do not know what happened to them. I fear they did not escape as we did." The journal also documented how Ruth and Naomi had planned their escape carefully. They had known that simply running away would not work. They would be caught and returned, or worse. They had decided that the only way to be truly free was to ensure their captors could never pursue them. "We knew what we were doing," Ruth wrote. "We knew it meant we could never return to Savannah, never use our real names again, never see our families. But we also knew we wanted to live. And so we did what we had to do." With the identity of Ruth Washington established, David began searching for descendants. Ruth's journal mentioned that she had married in 1912 to a man named Thomas Washington, a porter on the Pennsylvania Railroad. They had 2 children, a daughter named Dorothy, born in 1913, and a son named James, born in 1916. Through census records and genealogical databases, David traced the family line forward. Dorothy had married and had 3 children. One of her daughters, Patricia, was still alive, living in a retirement community in West Philadelphia. She was 86 years old. David called the retirement community and explained that he was a historian researching her grandmother's life. Patricia agreed to meet with him, curious about what he might have discovered. They met on a Sunday afternoon in the community's common room, a bright space with large windows overlooking a garden. Patricia was a small woman with gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that reminded David immediately of the woman in the photograph. Grace, now known to him as Ruth. My grandmother died when I was 6 years old, Patricia began. But I remember her clearly. She was a strong woman, very private, very careful about what she said. She never talked about her life before Philadelphia. When we asked, she would say only that she came from the South and that those days were behind her. David showed her the photograph. Patricia stared at it for a long moment, her hand moving to cover her mouth. "That's her," she whispered. "That's my grandmother. I've never seen a photograph of her from before Philadelphia. Where did you find this?" David explained his research carefully, watching Patricia's face as he described what he had learned about the Whitmore household, the evidence of abuse, and ultimately what Ruth and Florence had done to escape. He showed her the medical records, the journal entries, and the church records that documented her grandmother's new life in Philadelphia. Patricia listened in silence, tears streaming down her face. When David finished, she was quiet for several minutes. "All my life," she finally said, "I knew there was something my grandmother wasn't telling us. She would have nightmares sometimes, wake up screaming. She never liked being in closed spaces. She wouldn't even let us close her bedroom door at night. And she was always very insistent that we understand our worth as human beings, that no one had the right to treat us as less than human." She looked at the photograph again. "She's so young here, and she looks so..." Patricia struggled to find the word. "Resigned, like she's playing a role, wearing a mask." "I think that's exactly what she was doing," David said gently. "The Whitmores likely staged this photograph to prove they were treating their workers well, in case anyone questioned what was happening in that house. Your grandmother and Florence had to pretend everything was fine, even though they were being tortured." Patricia wiped her eyes. "And 3 days later, they fought back." "Yes." "Good," Patricia said firmly. "They deserve to be free. They deserve to live. If the law wouldn't protect them, if society wouldn't help them, then they had every right to save themselves." She asked David what he planned to do with his research. He explained that he wanted to write about Grace and Florence's story, to document what they had endured and how they had survived. He wanted to challenge the historical narrative that had branded them as criminals and ignored the abuse they had suffered. "I want people to understand that sometimes justice and the law are not the same thing," David said. "Your grandmother and Florence were not murderers. They were women fighting for their lives against people who treated them as property. What they did was an act of survival and resistance." Patricia nodded slowly. "Then you have my blessing to tell their story. My grandmother couldn't speak her truth while she was alive, but she documented it in that journal, knowing that someday someone might find it and understand. She wanted the truth to be known." David returned to his apartment with authorization from both families to conduct a final, comprehensive analysis of the photograph. Patricia and Andrea had both agreed that the truth needed to be fully documented, no matter what additional details might emerge. He contacted Dr. Rebecca Chen, a colleague at the Savannah College of Art and Design who specialized in forensic photography and digital image enhancement. When he explained what he had discovered about Grace and Florence and showed her the photograph, Dr. Chen immediately understood the significance. "If this photograph contains evidence of what happened, we need to examine it with every tool available," she said. "Bring it to my lab tomorrow." Dr. Chen's laboratory was equipped with technology that would have seemed like science fiction in 1904. High-resolution scanners, spectral imaging equipment, and sophisticated software that could detect and enhance details invisible to the naked eye. They began with a scan at the highest possible resolution, then used multiple wavelengths of light to reveal layers of information hidden in the photographic emulsion. David had examined the photograph dozens of times, but he had focused primarily on Grace and Florence themselves, on their expressions and their visible injuries. Now, guided by Dr. Chen's forensic expertise, they examined every millimeter of the image. "Look at this," Dr. Chen said, pointing to the area around the women's hands. "See these dark spots on their sleeves? They're not part of the fabric pattern. Let me adjust the spectral analysis." She typed commands into her computer, and the image shifted, revealing chemical signatures. The dark spots lit up in the analysis. They were biological in nature, consistent with old bloodstains that had been partially cleaned but not entirely removed. "Their clothing shows evidence of blood spatter," Dr. Chen said quietly. "Not a lot, but enough to suggest they were present when violence occurred." They moved their examination to the background of the photograph, to the mansion itself. David had noticed the windows before, but now Dr. Chen enhanced the interior visible through the glass with unprecedented clarity. In one of the ground floor windows, they could see into what appeared to be a dining room. The reflection was faint, but as Dr. Chen adjusted the contrast and sharpness, shapes became visible. 2 dark forms on the floor. David's breath caught. "Are those bodies?" Dr. Chen finished. 2 people lying on the floor in positions consistent with collapse. "And look here." She zoomed in further. "On the table behind them, those are plates, food still on them. This photograph was taken shortly after a meal." They stared at the screen in silence. The implications were staggering. The photograph had not been taken before the Whitmore deaths. As David had assumed, it had been taken after. Grace and Florence had posed for this portrait with the bodies of their former captors still inside the house. But why? Why would they document this moment? David thought back to Dr. Franklin's journal, to the coded entry about two sisters in flight and the network that had helped them escape. What if the photograph hadn't been taken by the Whitmores at all? What if someone else had taken it? Look at the angle of the shot, he said suddenly. It's not taken from a tripod at the height a professional photographer would use. It's lower, more informal. And the composition, it's centered on the women, not on the house. This wasn't a formal portrait commissioned by the Whitmores. Dr. Chen nodded slowly. You think someone from their community took this? As evidence, David said. As documentation of what had been done to them and what they had done in response. Look at their expressions again, knowing what we know now. They're not performing contentment for white employers. They're bearing witness. Doctor. Chen enhanced the image of Grace's folded hands one more time. There, partially obscured by the way her fingers were positioned, was a small, dark object. She increased the magnification to maximum. It was a small glass bottle, the kind used for medicine or poison. The label was not legible, but the shape was distinctive, identical to bottles used for arsenic solution in the early 1900s. She's holding the murder weapon, Dr. Chen whispered. Right there in the photograph. She's showing what they used. David felt his hands trembling. The photograph was not just a portrait. It was a confession, a testimony, and a defiant statement all at once. Grace and Florence had stood before that house, still dressed in the fine clothes their captors had forced them to wear, and they had allowed themselves to be photographed with the evidence of their act of resistance. But there was one more detail Dr. Chen discovered. On the wall visible through another window, partially obscured by lace curtains, was a calendar. She enhanced the image as much as the technology would allow. The date was barely visible, but it was there, April 23rd, 1904. The same date the Savannah Morning News had reported that Thomas and Charlotte Whitmore had died of arsenic poisoning. This photograph was taken on the day of the murders, David said, probably within hours. Someone came to the house, someone they trusted, and documented this moment before they disappeared. Dr. Chen saved all the enhanced images and compiled a technical report detailing her findings. As she worked, David sat back, overwhelmed by the weight of what they had uncovered. The photograph that had seemed like a simple portrait of two domestic workers was actually one of the most extraordinary documents of resistance he had ever encountered. It showed two women who had been tortured and imprisoned, who had fought back against their oppressors, and who had made sure their story was documented, even though they knew they would have to disappear forever. Grace and Florence had not slipped away in shame. They had stood in front of that house, looked directly into the camera, and claimed their moment of justice before vanishing into new lives. David spent the following weeks preparing a comprehensive presentation of his findings. He contacted both families again, showing them the enhanced images and explaining what Dr. Chen had discovered. The reactions were complex: horror at the violence, pride at their ancestors' courage, and grief for the suffering they had endured. Patricia sat in her living room, looking at the enhanced image that showed the bottle in her grandmother's hand. She kept this secret her entire life, she said softly. She built a new life, raised children, became a respected member of her community, and she never told anyone what she had done to survive. Andrea, viewing the images in David's office, had a different reaction. They made sure someone knew, she said, pointing to the photograph. They didn't run away in the night like criminals. They stood there in daylight and let someone document what they had done and why. That's not shame. That's testimony. David scheduled a public presentation at the Georgia Historical Society, inviting scholars, journalists, and members of both families. The room was packed when he began his presentation, walking the audience through his research step by step. He showed the original photograph first, explaining how it had seemed like a simple portrait. Then he revealed the enhanced images, one by one, allowing the audience to see what modern technology had uncovered. Gasps filled the room as the bodies in the window became visible, as the bloodstains on the sleeves became clear, as the bottle in Grace's hand was revealed. For 120 years, David said, this photograph has hidden in plain sight. It was catalogued as a simple portrait of domestic workers, but it is actually one of the most powerful documents of resistance from the post-Reconstruction era that I have ever encountered. He explained the evidence of abuse he had found, the medical records, the neighbor testimonies, the journal entries. He described the system of forced labor that had trapped Grace and Florence, and the complete failure of legal and social institutions to protect them. Grace and Florence were not criminals, he said firmly. They were women fighting for their survival against people who treated them as property. When the law would not help them, when society would not protect them, they took the only action available to save their own lives. He showed the final enhanced image, the full photograph with all its hidden details made visible. Grace and Florence standing before the mansion, the bodies of their tormentors visible through the window, the poison bottle held as evidence, the date on the calendar marking the moment of their liberation. This photograph was taken by someone who understood what had happened, David continued. Someone who recognized that this moment needed to be documented, that Grace and Florence's story needed to be preserved even if they themselves had to disappear. This unknown photographer gave us a gift, the truth about two women who refused to accept that their lives had no value. He concluded by reading from Ruth's journal, and the entry where she described their decision to fight back. We knew what we were doing. We knew it meant we could never return to Savannah, never use our real names again, never see our families. But we also knew we wanted to live. And so we did what we had to do. The room was silent when he finished. Then Patricia stood up. My grandmother lived to be 76 years old, she said, her voice clear and strong. She married, had children, made friends, contributed to her community. She lived 43 years of freedom after escaping that house. That's 43 years she would not have had if she and Florence had not fought back. I'm proud of what she did. I'm proud that she survived. Andrea stood as well. Florence lived to be 80 years old. She spent decades helping other women escape abuse. She turned her survival into service. That's heroism, not criminality. These women deserve to be remembered not as murderers, but as freedom fighters. The Georgia Historical Society announced that the photograph would become part of their permanent collection, displayed with the full context of Grace and Florence's story. The image would be accompanied by the enhanced details, the medical records, the journal entries, everything that documented both their suffering and their resistance. David's research was published in academic journals and featured in national media. The story sparked conversations about forced labor in the post-Reconstruction South, about the failures of the justice system to protect black women, and about the complex ethics of resistance against oppression. But the most meaningful response came from descendants of Grace and Florence themselves. Patricia and Andrea met for the first time at the Georgia Historical Society exhibition opening, standing together before the photograph of their ancestors. They look so young, Patricia said softly. So much life still ahead of them if they could just get free. And they did, Andrea replied. They got free, and they lived, and they made sure their truth was documented, even if it took 120 years for someone to see it. David stood nearby, watching the two women connect across generations of silence and secrets. The photograph that had seemed like a simple portrait had revealed itself to be something far more significant. A testament to survival, a document of resistance, and a bridge between past and present. Grace and Florence had posed before the house knowing they would never be able to tell their story openly. But they had made sure the evidence existed. They had stood in front of a camera, held the proof of what they had done, and trusted that someday someone would look closely enough to see the truth. And finally, someone had. The photograph remained on display at the Georgia Historical Society, a small placard beside it reading, Grace and Florence, Savannah, Georgia, April 23rd, 1904. Two women who fought for their freedom and won. Visitors stopped before it daily, drawn by the elegance of the women in the portrait, then stunned when they learned what the image actually documented. Some saw criminals, most saw heroes. Everyone saw two women who had refused to accept that their lives didn't matter. David's final act was to create digital copies of all his research and deposit them with archives in Savannah, Philadelphia, and Atlanta, ensuring that Grace and Florence's story would never again be hidden or forgotten. Their names, both the ones they were born with and the ones they chose for themselves, were finally part of the historical record. The photograph that had looked like nothing more than a charming portrait of two women had revealed itself to be exactly what Grace and Florence had intended. Undeniable proof that they had existed, that they had suffered, that they had fought back, and that they had survived. Their silence had been necessary for survival, but their courage had been documented. And now, more than a century later, their testimony could finally be heard.